The Second American Revolution. During the fateful years of 1860 and 1861, James A. Garfield, a representative in the Ohio legislature, corresponded with his former student at Hiram College, Burke Hinsdale, about the alarming developments in national affairs. They agreed that this present revolution of Southern secession was sure to spark a future revolution of freedom for the slaves. Garfield. This is James A. Garfield, like the shittiest fucking president ever. They agreed that this present revolution... Garfield quoted with approval William H. Seward's irrepressible conflict speech predicting a showdown between the slave South and the free labor North. James A. Garfield echoed Seward's certainty of the outcome. The rise of the Republican Party, they agreed, was a revolution, and revolutions never go backwards. If civil war followed from secession, wrote James A. Garfield, then so fucking be it. For the Bible taught that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. Or as Burke Hinsdale put it, all the great charters of humanity have been writ in blood. England's was engrossed in the blood of the Stuarts. Fucking Stuarts. Wait, is it Mary Queen of Scots? And then England had a revolution? Wait, they chopped off Charles the First. Was he a Stuart? That's a revolution. The Glorious Revolution. That ain't revolutionary as chopping off a king's head. And also, they never had a constitution, so technically, England ain't never had a fucking revolution. Not one that fucking mattered, not one that was worth a shit. If civil war followed from secession, wrote Garfield, so be it, for the Bible taught that without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sins. But Hinsdale, he said, all the great charters of humanity have been writ in blood. England's was engrossed in the blood of the Stuarts, and that of the United States in the blood of England. Soon, perhaps, the slaves would achieve their charter of freedom in the blood of their masters. When the war came, James A. Garfield joined the Union Army and rose eventually to the rank of Major General. For him, the war was quite literally the Second American Revolution. In October 1862, James A. Garfield insisted that the conflict of arms must destroy the old slave-holding aristocratic social dynasty that had ruled the nation and replace it with a new Republican one. A few months later, while reading Louis Adolphe Thiers' 10-volume History of the French Revolution, James A. Garfield was constantly struck with the remarkable analogy which the events of that day bear to our own rebellious times. In December 1863, James A. Garfield doffed his army uniform for the civilian garb of a congressman. During the first 3 of his 17 years in Congress, he was one of the most radical of the radical Republicans. In his maiden speech to the House on January 28, 1864, Garfield called for the confiscation of the land of Confederate planters and its redistribution among freed slaves and white Unionists in the South. To illustrate the need for such action, he drew upon the experience of the English Revolution against the Stuarts. Do we hate the Stuarts? I like the only royalist I like, okay? Fuck the royalists. Fuck all kings and queens, princes and princesses. I like presidents. I like first ladies. I like whatever. I like presidents. So, a president is essentially a king, but just one tick away that they were elected. So they're actually, they were selected by the people, not foisted upon our heads. Also, the American Revolution against Britain. Our situation, said James A. Garfield, affords a singular parallel to that of the people of Great Britain in their Great Revolution, and an even more important parallel to our forefathers of 1776. Every one of the 13 states, with a single exception, confiscated the real and personal property of Tories and armies. The Southern planters were the Tories of this Second American Revolution. He continued, and to break their power, we must not only emancipate their slaves, we must also take away the platform. The platform. Said too. So what's my point? It's a good book. James M. McPherson, Abraham Lincoln and the Second American Revolution, by the author of Battle Cry of Freedom. So, 1776, every one of the 13 states, with a single exception, confiscated the real and personal property of the Tories in arms. The Southern planters were the Tories of this Second American Revolution. He continued, James A. Garfield, everybody, and to break their power, we must not only emancipate their slaves, we must also take the platform on which slavery stands, the great landed estates of the armed rebels. Take that land away, divide it into the homes for the men who have saved our country, whether it's black or white. And after their land was taken away, James A. Garfield went on, the leaders of this rebellion must be executed. They must be hung, quartered, fucking shot, banished, exiled, excommunicated. They must follow the fate of the Tories of the Revolution. These were harsh measures, Garfield admitted, but to let no weak sentiments of misplaced sympathy deter us from inaugurating a measure which will cleanse our nation and make it the fit home of freedom. Let us not despise the severe wisdom of our revolutionary fathers when they served their generation in a similar way. Garfield later receded from his commitment to confiscation and his belief in execution or banishment, but he continued to insist on the enfranchisement of freed slaves as voters, a measure that many contemporaries viewed as revolutionary. He linked this also to the ideas of the First American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, said Garfield. James A. Garfield later receded from his commitment to confiscation, his belief in execution or banishment, but he continued to insist on the enfranchisement of freed slaves as voters, a measure that many contemporaries viewed as revolutionary. Yeah, the right to vote, Jesus Christ. Before, they weren't, they weren't men, they weren't people, they were human, right? They were like property or something. So, now they have a right to vote. That's revolutionary as fuck. You got a right to vote. You got a right to pick your own leaders. You got a right to, vote for Barack Obama. You have a right to make a black man president. Jesus Christ, James H. Garfield. This is back in the 1860s. There's motherfuckers that's racist fucking today that would just be like, hey, you better shut your... Don't say what James Garfield said. That James Garfield, he's too revolutionary for me. James Garfield is to the left of half of Kentucky. Yeah. So what we got here, he later receded from his commitment to confiscation, his belief in execution or banishment. The Declaration of Independence, said Garfield in a speech on July 4th, 1865, proclaimed the equal birthright of all men and the need for the consent of the governed for a just government. This meant black men as well as white men, he said, and to exclude emancipated slaves from equal participation in government would be a denial of the very axioms of the Declaration. In 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as a compromise that granted blacks equal civil rights but not equal voting rights. When the southern states nevertheless refused to ratify this moderate measure, James A. Garfield renewed his call for revolutionary change to be imposed on the South by its northern conquerors. Since southern whites, he said in early 1867, would not cooperate with us in rebuilding what they had destroyed, we must remove the rubbish and rebuild from the bottom. We must lay the heavy hand of military authority upon these rebel communities and plant liberty on the ruins of slavery. This rhetoric of revolution was hardly unique to James A. Garfield. Numerous abolitionists, radical Republicans, and radical Army officers were saying the same things. The abolitionists, Wendell Phillips, was the most articulate spokesman for a revolutionary policy. He insisted that the Civil War is primarily a social revolution. The war can only be ended by annihilating that oligarchy which formed and rules the South, and makes the war by annihilating a state of So that's 3 pages, all right? I'm going to start doing these book reports. What do y'all think, huh? What do you think? Clearly, what the fuck I'm not doing isn't working. So, you know, whenever you're in doubt, you just gotta twist and shout. Capoeira Aikido, Ninja, Marines, Muay Thai. What else? Musangwe Tai Chi, Jun Kido, Xing Yi Quan, and Krav Maga.